We've all got our favorite ways of searing a steak, but to find out what's the best, I'm gonna put the 4 most common methods head to head and do a taste test to find out which is the sear champion of them all. This one is gonna be, wait for it, seriously good. Hey, I'm James from Smokin' Dad Barbecue, and you guys have asked what's my favorite method to sear. And for me, I've been falling in love with the sear that I get off of the Soapstone, but I've never done a head-to-head from Soapstone to cast iron. Well, what about the normal grill grate that comes with the Kamado Joe, or a previous video I've done before, the Caveman? So that's what we're gonna do today. We're gonna do 4 different types of sears head to head to find out which is best. Now, to keep things as even as possible, I went out and picked a New York strip loin steak, cut 4 equal size steaks out of that, and then have left them inside for a couple hours this afternoon, since this is a same day test, to salt brine. If I could have gone overnight, I would have absolutely done that, but we're gonna treat all 4 the same. To again reduce variables, I'm gonna cook them inside of our Big Joe, but I'm also gonna fire up our Classic so we can have a couple different sear surfaces going on at the same time. So in the Big Joe, I'm gonna use the Soapstone, that's the size that I have, as well as the cast iron, and find out which of these 2 is ultimate champion. And then on the Classic, I'm going to use the stainless steel grid that comes with the Kamado Joe, as well as the other half. We're just gonna drop it in the coals and do a Caveman sear. So we're gonna pull these all out, let them rest, slice them up, and give our feedback and scores of what method is the hands down champion for the best sear. Before we get started, I want to thank you guys for leaving this request in the comments in a previous video. I do read and respond to those. So right before we get started, if there's another idea you'd love to see me do, go ahead and let me know in the comments, and a future video could be yours. Anyways, let's prep our steaks and get ready to fire up our joes. Okay, so now that we've got our fire started in the middle area of our charcoal basket, let me show you how we're gonna set up for today's cook. So I'm gonna start with the X accessory ring, and I'm gonna place that on the very bottom tier. So that's gonna be what's gonna support my cast iron grid, as well as providing a little extra support to our Soapstone. And our Soapstone is going to be playing a dual character today. It's gonna part act as our heat diffuser for the first part of our cook. So let me show you how I'm going to drop that in. So that's going to act as a heat diffuser. We're going to cook up a little bit higher, and I'll explain why in a second. And it's also going to be our sear surface. Let's go ahead and drop in our cast iron half moon. And I'm going to oil these up a little bit once they have a chance to get some heat in them. So we'll sear a steak on there, sear another steak on this one, and we'll oil them both with a little bit of olive oil once they start coming up to temperature. For our reverse sear portion, what I'm actually going to do is drop in above this our cooking grids, as well as our raised grid extender. And so the reason I'm going for this setup is we're going to place our steaks right back here where they're protected from the Soapstone, which is acting like a heat diffuser. And so we're going to be using 2 out of 3 heat surfaces or heat sources inside of our Kamado Joe. So if you've been subscribed for a while, you've heard me mention this before, but if you're new to the channel, let me just explain a little bit more about the 3 types of heat sources inside of your Kamado Joe. So the first one is conduction. That's surface to surface contact. So if we were just to drop our steak right on the Soapstone, that would be a great example of conduction heat transfer from a hot surface to a cold protein like our steaks. The second is convection, which is the airflow that's going to be passing by our steak. And then the last is that sort of ultraviolet infrared type heat, which is like how you get a sunburn out in the summer because there's just energy radiating into your food. And this is probably the biggest mistake I come across with new to ceramic cookers, is that they're so quick to get the fire going and get their food on that they haven't properly heat soaked their ceramics. So we're going to be cooking the first part of our reverse sear around 270, 300 degrees indirect today, and at that temperature I should only be able to hold my hand on the dome for a couple seconds before it gets uncomfortable. If I throw my food on before then, I'm not getting that third heat source, which is that infrared energy coming into the meat, and I'm not really doing the conduction heat. I'm just getting the hot air, and that is more likely to dry out your food and not cook as evenly. It's like a microwave oven if you get it right, which is what helps render that fat deep inside of those cuts of steak and ultimately come out more tender. So apologize if this is repetition, but it is so important to getting a great result. So we're going to take the time it needs for that to be properly heat soaked. Then we're going to adjust our vents. Right now the bottom is all the way open, top is all the way open, as you can see behind me. I think you can see. And once we're heat soaked, we'll go ahead and adjust our vents. Then when we throw on our steaks, we'll go ahead and light our classic Joe as well. We're only using that again for the sear. All the steaks will be cooked on the big Joe in the exact same placement, on the exact same side of the grid. We don't want any of the cooking or the infrared energy or the convection energy or conduction energy to throw anything off. We just want to be able to separate the sear for today's experiment. So I'll rejoin you in a couple of minutes once our big Joe's up to temperature. So this is plenty early to be starting our classic, but when we do a caveman sear, we don't want to see any of this where we've got some partially lit charcoal and some black. That's going to taste awful. So we actually want to get this entire coal bed rocking. So we drop it on there, we're getting the proper caveman sear and no ashy taste whatsoever. So I'm okay if this is sitting hot a little longer than when we need it. Let's go ahead, just drop in our grill grate. I'll move this a little bit lower when it's time to do the sear. I just want to pre-warm it, not blast it the entire time. So our bottom vent's open, let's open our top vent and let this come up to temperature. All right, so our grills are just coming up to temp, almost ready. Why don't we take the opportunity now just to remove any excess moisture from the salt. It's been at room temperature for just about 3 hours inside. And if you haven't heard that before, the salt can do its work much quicker at room temperature than the fridge. So 3-4 hours of room temperature can make up a lot of ground on not doing that overnight salt brine. Now I could just use the surface moisture and our garlic and our pepper would have no problem adhering to the meat, but I really just love the flavor of adding a binder. And my favorite binder of all is some truff hot sauce, because that's just got some great earthy mushroom flavor from those the truffles in that. So I'm gonna use that as my binder today. You can skip that altogether or use any other hot sauce. But you're not going to taste hot sauce. It just adds a nice smoky depth and a little bit of surprise pop on the back of your tongue on that steak. It's really, really nice. So let's dry these off, add a little smear, and then add some garlic and some pepper, and we've already got our salt in there. I'll take you fast forward. All right, we've got 4 steaks, we've got 4 probes. Let's insert our meter probes and set it up to track all 4 steaks. I plan to pull each one of these off around 114 degrees Fahrenheit and then let them rest. So this is probe 1. We'll go over here, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, let's get our steaks on. So I'm gonna set these just across the back so they're protected by the soapstone. So these are in order, 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll see those, pull them off and they start hitting 114 internal temperature. All right, all of our steaks have hit 114 degrees internal temperature. It was about a 30-minute cook. at about 320 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're just a bit above that 270, 300 we want, no problem. That's not going to make a really big difference in terms of how things turn out. I did take the opportunity though at the halfway point to go ahead and flip them just to make sure everything is even Steven all the way through. So those are now inside resting, and it's time to crank up our Big Joe for Inferno mode. So to do that, I'm just gonna go ahead and pull off the grid extender, which we were using to get our steaks up really close to the dome so they got that infrared heat, as well as our two grids. We're not gonna use them in the Big Joe. We're going to use the Soapstone and our cast iron Half Moon. Our classic is also up to temperature. It's sitting, I think, right around 700 degrees. And so now that our coal bed looks really good, I'm just gonna go ahead and drop that grid right down to the lowest position on the divide and conquer. So once our Big Joe's up to temperature, I'll go bring the steaks back out and we'll be ready for some serious fun. I made the same joke twice in one video, can't help it. Anyways, see you in a few. All right, our Big Joe is just coming up to temperature, so let's start with our classic as it's ready. So we'll throw steak number 1 onto our grates, and steak number 2, it's going caveman style, which if you haven't seen caveman style, goes a lot like this. So we are getting our crust built up. I think we are pretty much there. So I'm just gonna go ahead and let that rest. And that's our first steak, steak number 1, done on the stainless steel grate. Let's let that rest. Let's go over to the Big Joe. All right, she's hot. Let's do our soapstone and our cast iron. Soapstone's number 3, cast iron's number 4, which I'll put back on the board in the same spot. All right, our cast iron steak is done. So there is our soapstone steak. I think it's got a great looking crust all the way around. Let's let that rest. All right, let's slice these up and get a slice for each to do our taste test. I'm not going to be using any finishing salt today because I don't want to get a little bit more on one, less on one, and have that have anything to do with our experiment. But when I go inside for dinner, we'll be adding some of those finishing salts. Okay, so let's take a look. So this is number 1. This was on the stainless steel grid on the Kamado Joe Classic. And it did a good job at edge to edge, medium rare. So I don't see any large gray area in that. And we have a nice Maillard reaction and a little bit of grill lines, so it's definitely looking even all the way around, but that's pretty good. This is our caveman style, right on the coals. And so for looking at doneness, I noticed the fat cap, it catches on fire as soon as it starts to melt. So I'll cut that off so we're not eating any charred bits there. But in terms of the crust itself, it looks really good. Pretty good crust. Maybe not as even as the stainless steel, but equal doneness all the way through. This is number 3, which is our soapstone. And that looks really good. That might be the thinnest line yet so far. So that looks really good. And then this is our cast iron grate, which cooked very quickly. And because the cast iron was maybe so hot, now the soapstone needs that heat and I'm used to it. The cast iron, I can actually see the lines on the other side of the reversible grid. So that just must be retaining that extra little bit of energy. And we got grid lines even though we were using the flat surface. And like the soapstone, we have paper thin bands on the sides. So that looks really good. So let me cut a slice of each one and we'll turn the camera around and do a taste test. So based on what you've seen so far, if you've already got a winner in your mind, let me know in the comments below and we'll find out afterwards if your prediction was right. But let's get in, start with our first steak. Grab my fork, starting over here, steak number 1. Looks good. So that's really good. but I'm not really able to detect much difference in terms of the crust itself and the sear versus the rest of the steak. The whole steak is good, don't get me wrong, but there's not that little bit of memorable texture that you get with a great sear. So I'm gonna give that one a score 6 out of 10. Maybe we'll have to change it once we try the other ones a little bit to adjust for the bell curve, but right now there's not much sear, great flavor, but I don't taste a crust of any sort. Let's try number 2, which is our Caveman. That's much better. That was really good. I don't know how I should give it a score yet, or wait till we try the other two, but I'm gonna give that a 9. Like, that was a really great crust. And the only thing that holds this one back from people loving it is just the idea of throwing in the coal. I'm not tasting any charcoal. If your coals are hot, they don't stick, ash doesn't stick, charcoal doesn't stick. Just remove any burnt fat and you're golden. That is a really good tasting steak. Let's try number 3, which is our Soapstone. Here we go. It's a good looking steak again. They don't look so good. That is fantastic. And so the flavor is a little bit different than the Caveman sear. That Caveman sear, if you like your foods smoked, it's not smoky, but it adds a little bit of that type of flavor profile to the steak. The Soapstone has a little bit less of that smoky taste. It didn't get any of that from being right in the charcoal, but so far that has the most pronounced crust of any that we've tasted so far. And so based off everything that we've had so far, I'm gonna give that a score of 10 because we are looking for the sear in this test. And right now that's got just that little bit of crunch, then that melts and I start to get the flavor of the salt that's in the steak, our pepper, garlic. I'm not tasting the hot sauce, but there's definitely the depth. So right now I think the Soapstone is surfacing our flavors the best. Let's try our last one, number 4, which is our cast iron. Again, who needs sous vide when you get edge to edge like that on reverse sear? Big fan, love it. Anyways, let's try this. That one, I'm trying to put my finger on the taste. You know, you saw it was only on there for seconds, and we got some of those black lines. If I could tongue tell it apart, the non-black lines taste pretty good. The black lines taste like black lines. And so that's one of the problems that I have with charcoal, and I no longer own the cast iron grid, the full-size grid. Now I do have the sear plate for the junior, and I like that, but if you're not careful with cast iron and it's too hot, you get nice black lines, which are kind of nice burnt lines, and no Maillard reaction on the rest of the surface, no crust, if you will. And it feels like this steak is suffering from that as well, where I'm tasting a little bit of burnt. I'm not able to taste the garlic and the pepper, likely because they're part of that black line. And the black line itself, well, it has a crunch to it, similar to our Soapstone. It's not near as pleasant. So let me take these inside to the family. I'll rejoin in a second. We'll do a recap. All right, recap time. Now, I think I got so caught up in enjoying wonderful steak, I forgot to give a score on the last 2. So that Soapstone for me was the best of the group. So I'm giving that a 10. And the cast iron, it disappointed me in terms of the flavor. It just, again, didn't preserve any of that garlic, the pepper, or even the salt content for that matter. Just was overpowered by a bit of that charred lines that we drew on the steak. If you like lines, cast iron's great, but in terms of taste, I think it falls short today. So I'm gonna give that a score of 5. So our order here again, bringing up the rear, was cast iron. Still a great steak, better sear than anything I've ever gotten off a gas grill or a wood pellet grill where you don't get those high heat temperatures. But in today's test, you know, this is the Olympics here. You gotta be the best of the best, and it came home in the rear. In third place is our stainless steel grids. Really surprised me that they're actually starting to draw some lines. So we did get some, you know, pretty looking lines and a good Maillard reaction, but it just was a little bit short in terms of that crunch to do any better than third today. Second place, and a really remarkable sear, was Caveman. And this is not for everyone. Where I really like the Caveman is not for a perfectly flat steak. If you have something like a tri-tip, which is a little bit harder to get a sear on because it's round, or a tenderloin or something like that, Caveman is a phenomenal sear because you can just really get a great sear all over your entire steak. But when we're dealing with perfectly flat steaks, we've got a perfectly flat soapstone, and it just had that extra little pop. And so that is our hands down winner today. I didn't cover it already, but another thing I do like about the soapstone is that it doesn't rust. Occasionally I leave my grills out, or my grids out, pardon me, and sometimes rain or snow or something comes in, and you come out the next day and you've got a wet, if not rusting, piece of cast iron. Don't have that problem with a soapstone. You can also wash it with mild dish soap and not worry about removing your seasoning. It's antibacterial, and it's really good for a lot of other surfaces like seafood because it distributes that heat more evenly. Remember at the very beginning of the video we talked about conduction, which is surface to surface, and it just more evenly distributes the heat. So I'm a huge fan. I wish I discovered this earlier instead of buying two, half moon cast iron grids way back when. But if you haven't done that already and you're looking for your very first secondary surface, go with the soapstone. I think you'll absolutely love it. Speaking of loving it, if you love this video, please go ahead and smash that like button, let YouTube know so they show it to more people, and let me know by hitting subscribe to catch future videos. Anyways, until next time, I'm James from Smokin' Dad Barbecue signing off, and remember, don't be afraid, fire it up.